If there was salvation to be found anywhere amongst the jagged rocks and blazing sand of the merciless Sonoran desert, it would have been in the ramshackle wooden church, sitting alone by itself, miles away from the nearest road, and 3 times that length from the nearest town, a victim of decades of neglect and indifference, in addition to the near-constant assault of the sun's wrath. The old church's doors hung open on tired, rusty hinges, its stained glass windows cracked and faded, its once majestic gold-coloured cross warped and askew atop the modest steeple. For years the pews had been uninhabited by weekly worshippers, and the closest thing to a priest to reside at the altar lately was a collared lizard crawling lazily across its surface. As the sun rose to announce the start of a new dawn on the 50th anniversary of the church's erection, a lone man appeared at its front steps, as if he had sprung out of the ground. His skin was so weather-beaten, it seemed as rough and dark as leather. Thick white hair sprouted around his gaunt face and neck, and he appeared so wizened that it seemed a passing vulture could have easily flown off with him had it chosen to. The man sat motionless on the crooked front steps, staring despondently downwards at the sand and scorpions. Facing away from the church doors, and clutching within his frail hands a sawn-off double-barrel shotgun, with no hope in his eyes that it would be of much use. After an hour, another figure appeared on the horizon. A woman this time, nearly as old as the man, limping barefoot across the harsh terrain, while leaning her weight upon a thick, awkward metal cane. A silver crucifix hung from around her neck, and as she approached the small shelter, she gasped with relief to find the old man there, waiting. She spoke as she lowered herself to sit beside him.
I'm glad I won't be standing alone. I knew there had to be others as dedicated as myself.
The old man didn't look up as he nodded slowly and responded in a heavy, strained voice, which sounded like the creak of a steel door that hadn't been used in years.
There were several tasks with keeping it safe. It was our purpose. We were to always remain prepared.
The old woman lifted her cane in both arms, revealing it to actually be a Winchester rifle.
I've been ready for 50 years.
She spoke dutifully, without excitement or fear, only a calm that expressed acceptance. After another hour, 2 more arrived. A one-legged man with a grey ponytail and heavily tattooed arms staggered towards them supported by a wooden crutch. A Colt revolver hung from a holster on his belt. A 14-year-old girl with a plaid dress and sandy hair followed shortly after him. She carried a dusty Beretta that she could barely hold steady with 2 hands. By 10 o'clock, 2 more had arrived. A young mother in stained second-hand clothes brought her very sunburned 6-year-old son by the hand to the steps to sit beside the others. The mother carried an old Glock handgun with a cracked barrel in an apron pocket, and her son tearfully accepted a snub-nosed revolver from her after they were seated.
You must not run. They will catch you if you do. You need to stand your ground and stop as many as you can who come to enter the church. Do you understand?
The young boy cried softly as he clutched the gun incorrectly in one hand and a blistered foot in the other. The day wore slowly on. None of the 6 spoke to each other as the sun beat down upon them. They only stared, silently, in 6 different directions, none facing the church, as the sun climbed higher. Just after midday, the mother pointed towards the horizon.
Over there.
She indicated to the cloud of dust and the approaching gleam of something metal glinting against the sun. The six stood and arranged themselves in a straight line, raising their weapons shakily, forming a protective line in front of the church's doors.
Ask for strength, and it shall be granted. Stand fast, and remember what's at stake.
Within another few minutes, a shining black truck came clearly into view. It drove directly towards them, rocking slightly over the rough terrain, until it came to a halt a stone's throw away from the six defenders. The old man could see them all reflected in the truck's spotless windshield, and to him they looked like truly pitiful soldiers indeed. The doors opened and two men emerged from the comfortable, air-conditioned cab. The driver was as pale as death, with stark, white blonde hair, which fell raggedly behind him to graze his black leather jacket. Two Desert Eagle handguns shone like diamonds in their holsters on his belt. He wore an ammunition belt over his shoulder, as if he'd expected to require enough shots to mow down a small army. The passenger was slightly shorter, with a dark stubble and long, untamed red hair. His brown leather jacket looked older than he was, and he had his own black handgun strapped to his belt, in addition to what looked to be a machete in a sheath on his other hip. He wore a golden rosary around his neck, which almost outshone the glint of his weapons. Both men wore dark glasses and looked entirely indifferent to the line of desperate soldiers before them, blocking their way. Regardless, they took two careful steps forward, away from the truck, leaving the doors open and the engine running, and their hands only a few short inches away from their gun belts. The silent standoff lasted only a few seconds before the old man spoke, with a voice that sounded both terrified and tired.
Listen here, you two. You get back in that truck and drive off. There's nothing here for you.
The pale driver didn't move. His hair flicked lazily back and forth in the warm breeze. The truck's passenger spoke after a moment.
Would any of you like some water?
He spoke cautiously, as if unsure of how best to handle the situation. 6 guns pointed at his face clearly wasn't enough to discourage him into just giving up and leaving, but he didn't seem prepared to abandon any hope of an agreement being struck instead of just opening fire on the group. The young boy whimpered, but the old man held his ground.
We have need of nothing you could offer us. Leave now.
The passenger turned partially to glance at his partner, but the pale man continued to stand motionless and stare back at the group. After a moment of consideration, he tried again, raising a hopeful eyebrow.
How about we all go inside, put down our guns, get out of the sun, and talk about this? How does that sound?
The old woman aimed her Winchester right at his throat.
If you take another step towards us, we'll send you to hell.
The passenger licked his lips slowly, any traces of hope leaving his face. His hand drifted down to the butt of his gun. He looked the old woman in the eye.
Your crucifix is upside down.
All 6 of the defenders opened fire at once. The 2 men dove back behind the open doors of the truck, shielding themselves from the onslaught of bullets. Drawing his Desert Eagles, the pale man crouched and spun, peering behind the door long enough to fire a shot through the head of the little boy. The child's body was hurled backward and slammed into the church's outer wall. The mother didn't even flinch as she fired 2 more shots into the door, but the pale man rolled across the ground with lightning speed and emptied 2 more shots into her chest and neck. The passenger ducked as the old man's shotgun blast shattered the truck's side window and returned fire through the broken glass and caught the old man in the left forearm, sending him spinning off his feet. The passenger fired a quick round into the tattooed man's single leg, which knocked him on his back. He fired a third shot into the old woman's shoulder, and her rifle slipped, but amazingly didn't fall from her grasp, and he had to put 2 more into her chest before she collapsed into the dust. The pale man walked calmly towards the girl, just as her Beretta jammed, and he shot her through the eye. Leaving the cover of the truck, the 2 men came forward, their weapons up, and aimed at the 2 remaining threats. The tattooed man tried to raise his gun again from his position on the ground, but the passengers shot him twice more in the chest. The old man, the last defender, shakily tried to stand, his shotgun splattered with his own blood and coated with a layer of dust.
You're both doomed.
He choked and lifted the shotgun at them with his withered fist.
Don't be a hero.
The passenger started to say, but the pale man fired 4 shots into the old man before he could fire his weapon again. There was a moment of harsh silence. The only sound, the faint echoing of the final gunshots, fading into nothingness. Both men didn't move for several heartbeats. Finally, the pale man lowered his gun and holstered it, and pulled from his pocket a silver flask with a cross engraved upon it. He took a long drink and walked slowly back toward the truck. The passenger stood there with his gun out for another moment in stunned silence, looking around him at the carnage, shocked and dismayed at what they had been forced to do. He finally lowered his weapon and turned away from the mutilated bodies to look back at his companion.
What now?
He asked heavily, and was about to follow him back to the truck when the sound of something scratching the sand made him pause. He glanced down to see the old man's blood-soaked hand slowly opening itself, his fingers digging through the earth as the hand began to search for the fallen shotgun.
Now, we're in real trouble.
The passenger froze in pure terror as all 6 corpses raised themselves up from the ground, their bones snapping and popping as their bodies contorted themselves, their limbs elongated and their jaws detached from their skulls, leaving their mouths to hang open limply as their tongues swelled. From the back of the truck, the pale man calmly pulled out a broadsword in a leather scabbard. With one quick swipe of his arm, he swung the sword through the air, launching the scabbard into the desert behind him, and from the silver flask splashed the blade with holy water. From the hands and feet of the old man shot a black talon with a sickening tearing sound, and the 4 appendages raised the torso into the air, making the body resemble some kind of monstrous crab. The old man's head spun around on its elongated neck, a long black serpent tongue protruding from its broken jaw, and it charged at the passenger with inhuman speed, roaring like some kind of demonic mountain lion. The passenger staggered backward, wildly firing shot after shot at the creature, and the bullets tore through its skin like razors through wax, spraying sickly thick blood behind it. But the wounds did nothing to slow its crazed attack. As the passenger fell onto his back, the old man crab creature pounced upon him. Dropping his gun, the frantic man grabbed at the monster's head as its collection of jagged fangs tried to crush his face. The vile black tongue twisted about his neck like an eel, and he dug his thumbs into the creature's glazed, dead eyes, trying in vain to stop its attack. The toxic breath of the creature gagged him and set a fire in his lungs. Just as he was about to lose consciousness, the tip of the broadsword appeared through the wide open mouth, stopping an inch from the man's own face. The creature released him as the sword was retracted. Howling in pain and rage, it turned on its new attacker, just to meet the blade again as it cleaved the head in half vertically in 2 equal pieces. The monster collapsed, and the pale man hacked off each leg of the creature in quick succession before turning to face the other 5. Apparently wary of the sword, they'd surrounded the 2 men, but had hesitated before attacking. The passenger's head was spinning as he shakily took to his feet, nauseous with disgust and adrenaline.
Thanks for cutting in.
Steel up. Head down.
The pale man replied, his left hand pointing his Desert Eagle handgun forward in front of him, his right hand keeping a firm grip on the sword handle, its blood-stained blade resting upon his outstretched left forearm. The passenger pulled his machete from its sheath and took off his sunglasses, revealing fierce green eyes. The other 5 bodies had all warped in appearance as well, and formed an impassable barrier between the men and both the church and the truck. The old woman's forearms had lengthened and sharpened into fierce black talons, and as she stood, perched upon her new, elongated legs, she resembled a praying mantis ready to strike. The tattooed man's single leg had sharpened to resemble a scorpion's tail, as he balanced upright on his arms as if they were legs. The mother and the 2 children's rib cages had all ripped through their torsos to create extra mutated appendages. The 5 creatures warily roared at the men, assessing them the way a pack of lions would test the resolve of the lion tamer.
Why didn't they just do this before?
The smallest creature charged forward and leapt into the air directly at him, its ribcage spread wide like the hungry teeth of a waiting bear trap. The red-haired man swung his machete upwards in an arch and lodged the blade deep enough into the warped flesh to knock it off course and sent it crashing into the sand. The pale man fired 6 rapid shots and scattered the other creatures long enough to roll across the scorched ground on his back, and lessen the distance between himself and the truck. He dodged a strike from the scorpion creature's tail and gouged out a chunk of its torso with a perfectly timed blow from the broadsword. The creature let out an enraged roar, horrific enough to chill their blood, but both men held their ground. The pale man pointed his Desert Eagle at the monster that had once been the old woman, but a squid-looking creature that had once been the little girl leapt at him and swallowed his entire gun, hand and arm, right up to the elbow in her cavernous jaws, before wrapping her tentacles around him. Before the demon child could bite down fully into the flesh of his arm, he fired his handgun in rapid sequence from within the creature's throat, and the hot metal tore through her insides, out her back, and into the flesh of the wounded scorpion creature. The demon girl fell in pieces from the pale man's arm into a bloody pulp at his feet. He took the opportunity to sprint towards the trunk, Meanwhile, the passenger was firing his own handgun at the creatures that had been the old woman and the mother. The bullets kept them at bay, but weren't stopping them. When the gun was empty, he let it drop from his hand and pulled the golden rosary from around his neck. Wrapping it quickly around his fist like brass knuckles, he kissed the small crucifix and charged the spider-like creature that had previously been the young mother. With all his might, he punched the creature directly into its bullet wounds. And when the rosary made contact with the withered flesh, it burned as if pressed with a hot brand. The creature let out more of a wail than a roar, and collapsed in agony. The man sprinted towards the church steps, the praying mantis creature just behind him. Just as it was about to snatch him in its talons and lift him off his feet, the truck collided with it, smashing it to the ground. The powerful car pinned it down as the pale man jumped out from the driver's seat and plunged the broadsword into the monster's broken chest. Safely upon the church stairs, the passenger wrenched the ancient door open and made the rusty hinges scream. The tattooed scorpion creature came at him like a charging bull. But, with a well-timed kick at the hinges, the heavy wooden door broke from its mounting and collapsed upon the wounded creature, crushing it on the stairs. The final creature, the former young mother, wounded and wary, skittered across the sand, its breath heaving in and out heavily like a rhino, and came towards the pale man by the truck. The man nimbly jumped up upon the hood of the truck and pulled a 12-gauge shotgun from the roof rack. Instead of aiming at the approaching creature, however, he aimed skyward and fired 3 deafening blasts. The creature continued forward, and for a moment, nothing happened. And then, suddenly, with an ear-splitting crash, the golden cross from atop the church steeple came crashing down, ricocheting off the roof, and fell fully upon the creature, impaling it against the blazing sand. For a moment, there was silence as the 2 men stood motionless, one on the church steps and the other on the truck's hood, catching their breath and prepared to react if any of the creatures stood back up. None of them did. The pale man leapt down from the hood and pulled the broadsword from the mutilated corpse of the creature still pinned beneath the truck. Shotgun in one hand and sword in the other, he jogged up the steps to meet the other man. The red-haired man sighed and nodded towards the truck before they both entered the musty and extremely hot entryway.
That was a rental.
The pale man didn't respond, but removed his sunglasses, revealing jet black, shining eyes with no whites or corneas. He wiped his brow and tucked the sunglasses into his pocket. As he walked, thick blood dripped off the blade of the broadsword, leaving a trail of ooze in his wake.
Were they all once like you?
Not quite. I was always cleaner, and had wings.
The 2 men walked around the altar, their footsteps echoing loudly in the empty church, and approached the golden box installed in the back wall like a safe.
Inside the tabernacle,
The red-haired man pulled a small key from the safety of his jacket pocket, unlocked the golden doors, and slowly opened them. Revealing an empty compartment big enough for perhaps 3 textbooks.
on the ceiling,
The pale man motioned with his chin, his hand still firmly clasped around the sword and shotgun. Feeling around with his hand upon the compartment's ceiling, he found a small button, perhaps the size of a dime, and pressed it upwards. A grinding sound came from the floor directly behind them at their feet, and a trapdoor slid slowly open to reveal a very long, thin slot between the floorboards. The dust wafted up all around them, like a fog, as very old, hidden machines beneath them were awoken after decades of neglect. When the dust cleared, the red-haired man reached down and pulled from the hidden vault a 5-foot-long ancient spear. An inhuman skull punctured atop its jagged end, and from the spear point protruding from the crown of the skull, bright red blood dripped freely, even though it had been buried, undisturbed, for 50 years. The red-haired man touched the point delicately with a fingertip, and the warm, wet blood stained his skin.
So the legends were true after all. The weapon that has the power to determine the fate of mankind. And we're the ones unlucky enough to find it.
He turned to look the pale man in his shiny, black eyes.
Why didn't they ever destroy it?
He indicated with a nod of his head to the demonic corpses out front.
They couldn't enter the church. We're just lucky we made it before the whole building collapsed.
Clutching the spear firmly in both hands, partially in reverence and partially in fear, the red-haired man followed the pale man back out of the church and onto the front steps.
Could have been worse, I guess.
The red-haired man started to say before the words died in his throat. Outside, scattered upon the sand, stood at least a dozen more withered and weather-beaten people, all standing in complete silence, staring directly at them, their piercing, merciless eyes unblinking and wide, apparently unbothered by the blazing sand caught by the wind. The two men turned and looked at each other, and as one they both put their sunglasses back on. The pale man cocked the shotgun with one hand and raised the broadsword in the other. The red-haired man raised the spear before him, the wet blood at the tip glinting in the desert sun. He kissed the crucifix on his golden rosary, which was still wrapped around his fist.
I'm driving back.
Together, they leapt forward off the church steps.
There's always a reason to be afraid.